Good morning, students. This is our part 5th for the history chapter, the making of global world. In the earlier parts, we have talked about so many issues that how the First World War has affected the depression, economic depression. Now, in this part, we are talking about the First World War and its effect on entire world. The First World War during the 1914 to 18 was mainly fought in Europe, but its impact was felt all around the world. Notably for our concerns in this chapter, it plunged the first half of the 20th century and and it has converted this century into a crisis that took 3 decades to overcome. During this period, the world experienced the widespread economic and political instability and another catastrophic war. The wartime transformation, that during the war, how the countries allied and the allies power transformed. The First World War, as you know, was fought between two blocs. One side, Allies country, which included Britain, France, Russia. After some time, the US also joined them. And the opposite side, there were the Central Powers, Allies power and the Central Power. Central Powers included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. When the war began in August 1914, many governments thought it would be over by Christmas. Okay, that when the war started, the First World War, all the country thought that it will be uh, completed within the Christmas. It lasted more than 4 years, but we know that how long the First World War was having time, that it has taken 4 years continuously. The First World War was a war like no other before. The fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, all the countries, Allies power and the Central Power. These countries were the world's leading industrial countries that time, which now harnessed the vast power of modern industry to inflict the greatest possible destruction on their enemies. And that's why all these industrial developed countries has used so much of you can say industrial power or the technology to kill their enemies. That's why the First World War, known as a modern industrial war, First World War, known as a modern industrial war, it was the use of machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, chemical weapons, etc., on a massive scale. These all were increasingly products of modern large scale industry. To fight the war, millions of soldiers had to be recruited from around the world and moved to the front lines on a large ships and trains. The scale of death and destruction is all about 9 million dead and 20 million injured was unthinkable before the industrial age. Without the use of industrial arms, so you can see that after the First World War, there was a huge mass killing, and it was only thought because they were using the industrial arms. Most of the killed and maimed were men of working age. These deaths and injuries reduced the able bodied workforce in Europe, with fewer numbers within the family. Household income declined after the war. It all about the ill effects of the war, First World War. Now, during the war, industries were restructured to produce war related goods. Entire societies were also recognized for war. As men went to battle, women stepped into un- undertake jobs that earlier only men were expected to do. Now you can see that after the First World War and during the First World War, as the men were preparing themselves to fight the war, now the female came out from the houses to earn their livelihood. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic power, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. Now the countries which were giving you can say financial help earlier to the nation, now they were also coming under threat. So Britain borrowed large sums of money from US. Britain, which was earlier, you can say, financially a very good condition the Britain was having. Now the Britain is having the poor condition, that they are borrowing large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public. Thus the war transformed the US from being an international debtor to an international creditor. That's why the First World War was having the effect that the First World War has converted the US as a creditor, and earlier it was a debtor. In other words, at the world's end, the US and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens owned in the US. And you can say after the end of the First World War, US and its citizens having overseas assets than foreign governments and citizen owned in the US. You can see that how US emerged as a financially very powerful country during the First World War and after the First World War. Now, post-war recovery. Now we are talking about that after the First World War, how all the damages was recovered, either in financial, either in social, and either in political. How in Europe the war recovery has been done. Post-war economy, we are focusing here the First World War. Post-war economy recovery proved difficult. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular faced a prolonged crisis. While Britain was preoccupied with war industries and developed in India and Japan, after the war, Britain found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and compete with Japan internationally. Moreover, to finance war expenditure, Britain had borrowed liberally from the US. This means that at the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. Now you can see that the condition that earlier Britain was financially a very powerful country, but after the First World War and during the First World War, Britain has changed into a debtor, and it has taken so much of you can say financial support from the US, as the Britain wants to compete with Japan internationally. So it was the scene. Now, the war led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production, and employment. When the war boom ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. At the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with the peacetime revenues. These developments led to a huge job losses. In 1921, in every 5 British workers was out of work. Indeed, anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Now you can see that the job, you can say, insecurity and anxiety became a enduring part of the post-war scenario after the First World War. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. Consider the case of wheat producer. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat in the world market. When this supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded dramatically. But once the war was over, production in Eastern Europe received and created a glut in what output. Grain prices, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt. Now, another drawback of the First World War that the condition of agriculturists and the poor farmers became so pathetic, and their economy dramatically came into decline. As and the wheat producing countries or the states which were earlier a major producer of wheat, now they are also unable to compete with the time and the space. So in the farmers condition, they were also under the debt after the First World War. Now They were in trouble in the years after the war. The US economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. Now, one important feature of the US economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production and had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s it became a characteristic features of industrial production in the US. A well-known pioneer of mass production was the car manufacturer Henry Ford. He adapted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse in which slaughtered animals were picked apart by the butcher as they came down on a conveyor belt to his new car plant in Detroit. He realized that the assembly line method would allow a faster and cheaper way of producing vehicles. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as the fitting a particular part of a car at a pace directed by the conveyor belt. This was a way of increasing the output per worker, speeding up the pace of work. Standing in front of a conveyor belt, no worker could afford to delay the motion, take a break, or even have a friendly word with a workmate. As a result, Henry Ford's car came off the assembly line at 3-minute intervals, a speed much faster than achieved by previous methods. The Model Ford was the world's first mass produced car. The Model Ford was the world's first mass produced car. At first, workers at the Ford factory were unable to cope up with the stress of working on assembly lines in which they could not control the pace of work. So, they quit in large numbers. Desperation, in desperation, Ford doubled the daily wages of 5 million in January 1914. At the same time, he banned trade unions from operating in his plants. Now, Henry Ford recovered the high wage by repeatedly speeding up the production line and forcing workers to work ever harder. So much so, he would soon describe his decision to double the daily wages as the best cost cost cutting decision he had ever made. Now, um, Fordist industrial practices soon spread in the US. They were also widely copied in Europe in 1920. Mass production lowered cost and prices of engineered goods. Thanks to higher wages, more workers could now afford to purchase durable consumer goods such as cars. Car production in the US rose from 2 million in 1990 to more than 5 million in 1929. Similarly, there was a spurt in the purchase of refrigerators, washing machines, radios, gramophones player, all through a system of hire purchase that is on credit repaid in weekly or monthly installment. The demand of refrigerator, washing machine, etc. was also fueled by a boom house construction and home ownership financed once again by loans. Now, the housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the US. Large investment in housing and household goods seemed to create a cycle of higher employment and income. Rising consumption demand more investment and yet more employment and incomes. Now, in 1930, the US resumed exporting capital to rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. US imports and capital exports also boosted European recovery and world trade and income growth over the next 6 years. All this, however, proved too good to last. By 1929, the world would be plunged into a depression such as it had never experienced before. Although there was so much, you can say, in a automobile sector, the car manufactured, like the brand name Ford in US, they have tried so much to boom the economy. They involve the working class. They double the wages also, but still by the 1929, all the Europe had faced a great economic depression. Now, the depression. What is all about the depression? The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid 1930s. During this period, most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. The exact timing and impact of the depression varied across country, but in general agricultural region and community were the worst affected. This was because the fall in agricultural prices was greater and more prolonged than that in the prices of industrial goods. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. We have already seen how fragile the post war world economy was. The first, agriculture overproduction remained a problem. This was made worse by falling agricultural prices. As prices slumped and agricultural income declined, farmers tried to expand production and bring a larger volume of produce to market to maintain their overall income. This worsened the glut in the market, pushing down prices even further. Farm products rotted for a lack of buyers. Second, a second reason of economic depression in Europe 1929. In the mid 1920s, many countries financed their investment through loans from the US. While it was often extremely easy to raise loans in the US when the going was good, US overseas lenders panicked at the first sign of trouble. In the first half of 1928, US overseas loans announced to over 1 billion. A year later, it was one quarter of that amount. Countries that depended crucially on the US loans now faced an acute crisis. Now, the withdrawal of US loans affected much of the rest of the world, though in different ways. In Europe, it led to the failure of some major banks and collapse of currencies such as British pound sterling. In Latin America and elsewhere, it intensified the slump in agriculture and raw material prices. The US attempt to protect its economy in the depression by doubling import duties also dealt another severe blow to the world trade. So it is all about the economic depression. In this video you have discussed about the economic depression of 1929, the great economic depression. We have talked about the post-war recovery of first world war, then rise of mass production and consumption, and interwar economy.